Have a good one.
Thanks so much.
Merci.
All right, well, thank you, Albert, and welcome to the last session. But I want to thank everyone for still hanging in there. We've got a great panel tonight, and we're going to be talking about whether or not Western governments are going to ban Hezbollah. And that's a very live topic here in Australia at the moment. There's been quite a few developments in the last 48 hours. But I thought, as tradition, we should start off by asking the panel to introduce themselves. So could I ask Boaz to introduce himself briefly, just to those who haven't had the opportunity to meet you before?
Well, I'm Boaz Ganor. I'm the head of the International Policy Institute for Counterterrorism, or ICT in short, which is a Center of Excellence for Counterterrorism that was established 25 years ago within the Interdisciplinary Center, Herzliya.
Thank you. Dal.
Shalom, everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thank you, Albert, for initiating it and maintain it for so many years. This is most appreciated. Thank you for hosting me, and I am a reserve brigadier general in the Israel Defense Forces, dealing usually mainly in innovation, strategy, and leadership. And speaking about Hezbollah, I fought with them and fought against them for many years and still does.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for that. Yaniv.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. Yaniv Cohen here, the CEO of the Abba Eban Institute for International Diplomacy at IDC Herzliya. We're here because we are leading for the past almost 3 years an international effort with Hezbollah all over the world, making a diplomatic effort in order to prevent or to avoid as much as we can Gal's effort, which is the military one. So thank you for inviting us.
Kimberly.
Hello, good evening. I'm currently in Canberra in Parliament House, and the Senate, the Australian Senate, has just adjourned. I'm the chair of, well, firstly, I'm a follower in Stephen's excellent footsteps. And I'm the chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, and in the Shadow Ministry.
Thank you, Kimberly. Jason.
Well, look, first, thank you so much, Albert, for hosting this fantastic event. And look, when I saw who I'd be sharing the panel with, I thought there must be some kind of mistake that I could be possibly sharing a panel with such esteemed people such as yourselves. But then I realized that there was the quiet hand of Mr. Howe in the background, because I remember last year when I was writing a piece on how I was labeling Iran the biggest state kidnap-based country in the world, and I rang Alan to ask what ramifications there might be for the Australian and what ramifications might be for me. And he said, well, goodness me, if Iran went after one of our columnists, that'd be fantastic. So I'm very much looking forward to this session. It's very important, and I'm looking forward to having a great debate. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. And as Kimberly mentioned, I'm Stephen Conroy, now retired, and Kimberly doing a fantastic job in pursuing all of the issues that would be dear to all of our hearts on this panel and those who are viewing and listening. So thank you all for joining us. We thought we might focus on Australia and what's been happening in Australia, and the opportunity to have a discussion about why is it that Australia so far hasn't banned Hezbollah. And given, if you look at the growing list of countries, US, UK, Canada, Germany, and even New Zealand has a tougher position than Australia does on Hezbollah. So I thought I might throw to the panel, and I thought I might throw to the Australian as first about, why do you think the Australian government, and I've been a cabinet minister in the past, and I've been involved in some of the discussions behind the scenes about this issue myself, but why do you think? And then I thought overseas guests might want to comment on why we should ban Hezbollah. And many of you will have very similar views on this, but maybe Jason, I might throw to you first. Why hasn't Australia banned Hezbollah yet?
Well, goodness, thank you very much for the opportunity to kick off this session. I thought I would try to structure my response to that question in four categories. One, provided sort of a general observation. Two, the strategic context in which we're operating and living. Some inputs from the field, not necessarily directly related to Hezbollah, but similar types of terrorist organizations operate in a very similar way. And I thought you might, when you come to wrap it up at the end, I've got some 4 or 5 adaptive alternative approaches that could be included in a framework for consideration going forward. So in terms of, to answer your question, the sort of general observation that I would have is that, believing somehow that an organization like Hezbollah has a separate, distinct entity such as the political, social, health, terrorist, military wing is like believing in magic carpets. They just do not exist. There's no separation between them. And second general observation I would make, and this is important in terms of perhaps the way generally that the Australian political policymakers could think about things at times, is that if we accept the premise that war is politics by other means, and an extension of that is terrorism is just another application of warfare, then of course Hezbollah is engaged in that, not just in the Middle East, of course, where Israel is under threat constantly from that organization, but across the globe, because across the globe, Hezbollah has turned itself into what you might describe as a hybrid global terrorist organization, and its tentacles stretch across more than 40 countries. And what may present some conundrums for the Australian policy community and governments is perhaps the way that Hezbollah approaches its network across the world. And that sort of brings me to I guess the strategic context, because Hezbollah, like other terrorist organizations, is really fundamentally focused on the moral and mental game as opposed to just the physical. And what I mean by that is they are targeting the human terrain. In Australia, we're very good at dealing with physical contests, and we have been throughout our military history. But when it comes to tackling those that challenge our moral and mental makeup, we find that quite disorientating. And I'll just, I've actually drawn a bit of a little diagram. I hope you don't mind me using props. I like you to think about Hezbollah in terms of an octopus, because the way an octopus works is there's a fantastic creature to think about the way a terrorist organization like Hezbollah works. Because Hezbollah hasn't organized itself in terms of a classic, strict, rigid command and control structure. And that's like an octopus. An octopus is a very interesting creature because its tentacles all act independently. And so if you think about the terrain in which Hezbollah operates, the Middle East, the United States, Africa, the EU, South America, Australia, Asia, and of course, Lebanon. Now, each of those tentacles operates in a different way. It senses and feels its environment and operates and responds in the context of that environment. So the way it operates in Australia could be quite different to the way it operates in, for example, in South America. In South America, a classic example is that tri-national boundary area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. It's like the United Nations of crime in that location. And so it exploits the grey zone within those locations. Where I've worked in West Africa, I've seen the presence of Hezbollah in West Africa and the way it uses the West African framework and context in terms of logistics supplies, in terms of businesses, in terms of shopping centres, all those kinds of things which it uses to infiltrate that network. The way it operates in the EU is quite different in terms of how it is able to transport its cocaine into the EU. And perhaps that's where it presents a challenge for Australia, is because it doesn't operate quite like that in Australia. It operates quite differently. Why? Because it's very clever. It appreciates that if it's able to operate within the areas in Australia that are legally permissible, then it becomes very difficult when it doesn't cross that legal threshold for the Australian authorities to intervene. And a good example of that, in the way that it has very cleverly exploited the Australian network, is not necessarily the illegal side. It's actually the open, legitimate transnational trade and also social networks that is exploited in Australia. So, for example, last year, the Al Marabak charity organisation donated $10,000 to the New South Wales Fire Service. You've got photos of the New South Wales Fire Service personnel, accepting the check. It looks all very legitimate and very nice and friendly. It's a very clever way of occupying that mind within the Australian community that kind of says, well, there's nothing really wrong here. What are you talking about? So that's the sort of strategic context. And then from a field-based perspective, what I'd like to, guess for those of you who perhaps might be unfamiliar with what is happening on the ground in these kinds of locations, if you're an insurgent or a terrorist organization, and perhaps Gal can talk to this, what you want to occupy, you want to take control of a village, you take control of the political leadership, you can take control of the security leadership, and you can take control of the religious leadership. If you occupy those nodes in a village, then you control that village. And then you start to spread that web across the other villages, and all of a sudden you have this network across that human terrain. And when I was involved in contesting Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb between Cote d'Ivoire and southern Mali, we did the opposite. So we challenged that organization on the ground in those villages and made sure we protected and looked after and co-opted the support of the security leadership, the religious leadership, and the political leadership in order to maintain a stable village protection system that operated also like a sensitive network to detect infiltrators coming to that environment. That is, whether they were violent or if they were non-violent. Because one of the things that Al-Qaeda did in that part of the world, like Hezbollah did, is they came along and they offered the farmers to build wells. Well, the government's not there, so they built wells. I mean, we found that they hid their weapons inside the wells, but they were very, very charitable to the population up there. They won their hearts and minds, and that made it much harder for local authorities who had vacated that space and allowed that grey zone to be infected by the Islamic jihadists.
Jason, I think all of us are going to have that octopus firmly in our mind going forward. Now, Kimberly,
so that's the context there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Now, Kimberly, I know you and Christina Keneally have worked incredibly hard to get the debate around terrorism here in Australia. It's been, to some degree, described as right-wing terrorism, and that's going to be something I'm going to be asking all the panel about. But could you give us a picture for those who are overseas who haven't had a chance yet to keep up with the developments in the last 48 hours around the committee of inquiry that's been set up? Give everyone a picture of that and why that gives us an opportunity to bring this debate to a head.
So the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security has just started. It's only just been announced in the terms of references agreed that it will have an inquiry into matters relating to extremist movements and radicalism in Australia. And in fact, the first term of reference talks about Islamist and far right-wing extremist groups, and then goes on to say, how they've changed during the COVID-19 pandemic and the risk to the community of high-risk terrorist offenders. But where we are in Australia is that Australia has prescribed the external security organisation of Hezbollah until it's effective until the 2nd of May 2021. It designated the ESO in 2003. But as Jason's just gone through, obviously that's one arm, and it's a highly secretive arm of Hezbollah. And, I think it's good to have a look and for the Australian Parliament to have a look at Islamic and far right-wing extremist groups. And I think that will be very valuable, certainly for our intelligence agencies, which are, I think, incredibly professional and very well regarded internationally. And obviously, we're part of the Five Eyes. So, our intelligence agencies are held in very high regard around the world. So it will be, I think, that committee and that report, the evidence that's adduced at that committee will be interesting and will be very good. So for this panel discussion, will Australia ban Hezbollah in 2021? It well may. I mean, it's already banned a part of it, but it may well look at other parts depending on what this inquiry finds and what the report recommends.
Thanks.
I can go going, but maybe other panelists might want to comment on that.
Thank you for setting the stage, because it's
yeah. And I would just add, of course, the US
Yep.
has designated Hezbollah in its entirety as early as 1997, Canada in 2002, Holland in 2004. So we know that other countries around the world have banned Hezbollah. So I think, I think that just gives some context internationally.
Thanks, Kimberly, and we look forward to the great work of that committee, and we know that you'll be pushing hard behind the scenes to get this debate up and going. I thought I might throw to Boaz. Give us a rundown of your direct experience and why as Australia's security services, and it won't come as a surprise, but you can see from the public statements of our security services, they think there is this different tentacle that is okay. What is your direct rebuttal?
Thank you, Stephen. First of all, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Albert for another outstanding dialogue and being the last panel, we have a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. Second, since I'm Israeli, we are known to be non-politically correct. So let me beef the discussion by being non-politically correct. And I would say that not designating Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, this is a proof of stupidity. Banning only the military arm of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, this is hypocrisy. Now, I know quite well, if I may say so, the Australians. I refer to many of them as personal friends of mine, including Kimberly here, and of course, Albert and many others. I visited Australia for so many times, and I can tell you one thing, the Australians are not stupid and not hypocrites. So really, I'm totally puzzled with the decision or the lack of decision to designate the whole organization as a terrorist organization. And now, why am I so puzzled? Because when we are talking about, and Jason rightly noted that this is a certain type of a war, in this war, we need to understand who's the enemy. And we need to define, first of all, the enemy. We cannot fight the war without agreeing on the basic, and this is who is the enemy, who's the other side, who's the terrorist organization. How can we outlaw the organization? How can we prevent the incitement of the organization, funds which are being transferred to the organization, without agreeing that this creature is a terrorist organization, first of all. Okay, I'm quite familiar, believe me, with the problem of terrorism definitions. As long as Gal was fighting in the fields of Lebanon, I was fighting in the field of the academia world, in order to try to persuade my friends and colleagues, the scholars, to adopt one international definition of the term. And the term that I use, or the definition that I use for terrorism is the deliberate use of violence aimed against aimed against civilians by non-state actors in order to achieve political ends. Now, Hezbollah as an organization fits all the ingredients of this definition. And if we just analyze what they do, I don't want to go, I have the whole list here, starting in the 80s, how deliberately they attacked civilians, embassies, diplomats, journalists, and so on and so forth all over the world, including, by the way, their own president, their own prime minister, although this international tribunal let them off the hook just recently in a very hypocritical way as well. The recent concrete involvement in terrorism that we're familiar with, 2012, was the attack on the tourist bus in Burgas in Bulgaria, and another attempt in Cyprus that failed. Yes, they moved most of their effort from a classical terrorist organization into much bigger scale terrorist activity, and this is using rockets in an indiscriminate aimed against civilian targets, not just in Israel, by the way, but also through the Houthis versus the Saudis and so many other places in the world in which they are being used by Iran as a proxy for their subversive activity in those countries altogether. So yes, they are answering all those ingredients. As Jason was mentioning, Hezbollah is a hybrid terrorist organization. And what is a hybrid terrorist organization? A hybrid terrorist organization is a terrorist organization that controls territory and population, and therefore is involved in civilian activity, in parliamentarian activity, in what we call the dawah activity, in social activity, and so on and so forth. I would argue that hybrid terrorist organization is no less dangerous than a classical terrorist organization. Actually, it's much more dangerous than others because they have much more resources, much more capabilities, but also they deceive the world, camouflaging their terrorist activity with this pseudo-legitimate civilian political activity. And that's exactly, and by the way, Hezbollah is the mastermind of that type of activity. And many countries around the world are falling or want to fall, because it's very convenient to fall into this trap of emphasizing the differences between the civilian activity and the military terrorist activity altogether. Now, why is important? Why it's important that now, and it's late but not too late, that Australia will actually join this trend, global trend, in my view, very positive trend. And I saw the smile on your face when you said, Stephen, when you said that New Zealand is already on board, but Australia is lagging behind. It is ridiculous. It's so important because we are going to face in the coming weeks or months a new effort from Iran to use new measures of terrorism and subversive activity all over the world as an outcome of their feeling of revenge for Fakhrizadeh killing in Tehran, the nuclear scientist, and also Qasem Soleimani and others altogether. It's very important that right now that all the international community will stand as one and say, Iran, we know that you created this creature that is called Hezbollah. We know that you are using this creature for dirty work of Hezbollah for your purposes and your interests. We designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, and we are going to watch very closely their activity and your activity through Hezbollah altogether.
Fantastic. Thanks. Thanks so much for those insights. Yaniv, your views about why Australia needs to revise its thinking.
So first of all, as Jason, I prepared some props, but my prop is a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll be happy if you'll let me share it, if you have the ability to do so. But anyhow, the idea beyond what I'm going to present in the coming 5 minutes, I see that I cannot share the presentation. So I'll do it without
Alan, is Alan able to help us out behind the scenes? No?
Jason,
Sorry.
I saw your drawings and I thought that I have to do something like that. All right, let me bring my whiteboard and I will I would do it without the presentation. But the idea is, what I want to present is the discussion about learning from international experience and understanding that the idea behind Hezbollah, and it was discussed here, is not a matter of foreign policy alone. It's also a matter of internal policy. The examples in Germany, for instance, the designation of Hezbollah in Germany was a direct result of the understanding of the German government that this terror organization is well connected to German crime families from Lebanese origin. And we think that the case in Australia is not that different. And this is why I'm so happy for the last 48 hours change or
announcement
that were taken of a new parliamentary inquiry into the extremist movement in Australia. Because this is, by the way, what the Netherlands has done in 2003 and so on. So in order to understand the infrastructure, what one needs to do is to understand where Hezbollah gets its money from, and it was discussed here, but mainly $1.1 billion a year from three main sources. Most of it, around 70%, comes from Iran, and the remainder of 30% comes from the Shiite community all over the world and the actions of narcoterrorism and related crime. Now, Iran's portion of the budget is getting smaller for obvious reasons, geopolitical and international reasons, and it means that Hezbollah needs to find a way to find new sources or to increase the current sources of funding, and that means that it needs to go to increase its operation in terms of working with the Shiite communities and working with the narcoterrorism activities. And I can provide here in this particular session, what I wanted to present is two examples of cases in which radicalization in local mosques in Australia that can be connected, if we look at the international experience and the international paradigm of how Hezbollah work can be connected to an international network of radicalization, and also a local example of a crime family that is also connected. So I would start with the first example that, and it would take me like 5 to 6 minutes, but I think it's worth it. The first example is a big mosque in Sydney, Australia, known hub for radicalization, Shiite radicalization. But what we see there is that they are converting people to Islam, and not just converting people to Islam, that for itself is okay, of course, but the idea is that they're receiving money from the converted people. And what we can see in other places, we saw it in Münster in Germany, in Bremen, in Waiselkinderprojekt in Essen in Germany, is that the converted people are donating money to forced charity organizations. In Germany, in the Waiselkinderprojekt that was apprehended by the German authorities, there was millions of euros that were apprehended, and some of it went to the terror organization in Lebanon. So one way is to take the mosque, to take the Shiite religious centers as part of the FRD, part of the Foreign Relations Department of Hezbollah, which is not designated in Europe. As Kimberly said, the ESO is designated, but the FRD, the Foreign Relations Department, under the same leadership, is not designated. And that Foreign Relations Department operates those Shiite centers all over the world and recruits money or funds for the operation of the organization. So that's one aspect of things. And I think that the inquiry that is starting would be able to give the law enforcement the tools required in order to go deeper to those places, their activity and their international connection. Second relevant issue is the crime families. And Australia has, and I mentioned names here, there was a discussion at the Abba Ibn Institute team whether I should mention the names of the crime families or not. I'm not going to do it. But there are international crime syndicates located in Australia from Lebanese origin with branches all over the world. Some of it is the TBA in the tri-border area, and some of it are in other Gulf states, some of it in Lebanon. And it is the same families or the same structure of families that delivers drugs from one place to another based on the family infrastructure, and then the funds based on international experience, 20 to 25% of the funds goes back to Lebanon to fund the terror organization. So once again, the crime families or the crime syndicates in Australia is an internal issue, is an issue of domestic affairs. But when you get a broader view of the operation of the crime families, look at their family members all over the world, places like Lebanon, tri-border areas, and others, you see an international crime syndicate that supports a terror organization. Therefore, to conclude my remarks in that respect, I think that the method should be, or I would say 3 things from that should be put on the table. First of all, that it's not only a matter of international relations. It's a matter of domestic affairs, and the way to deal with it would be to give the local authorities the toolbox that they need in order to do it. Second, and very importantly, it's not just about terror per se. It's about narco-terrorism. It's about radicalization in mosques and so on. And third, I think it should be a concentrated effort. As the word octopus was mentioned here, so I won't mention that word, but I would mention the word industry. Hezbollah is an industry. And in order to fight an industry, you need an industry. Means we need a concentrated effort of all the law enforcement agencies, both domestic and foreign ones, in order to fight them in an effective way. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Gal, your experiences firsthand and why Australia needs to reconsider.
Well, I think I must, by your permission, speak my mind.
Please do. We wouldn't have it any other way.
Look, I'm afraid we are actually living in a period that reminds me the period before September 11th. You know, these years, we Israelis that were always the front guard of fighting terrorism, actually the fortress on the living spring of terrorism in the Middle East, trying to convince the rest of the world what is terrorism and what is it all about. And we were for many years under terrible criticism that we are too paranoid, too impulsive, too aggressive. And actually, we could not really convince until it arrived to the neighborhoods of the rest of the world. And we were fighting and struggling for many years in order to recharge our legitimacy battery to fight terrorism in the best manfulness we can. And after September 11th, I can tell you that firsthand, I felt that when the world understood what terror means, and when United States of America and the coalition around it actually defined GWOT, Global War on Terror, we Israelis in a heartbeat started to feel that our legitimacy battery has been recharged. And here's the thing, the tragedy, and I hope it won't happen, the tragedy may be that only when Australia will remember again what terror means, they will immediately take this decision, because probably the memories of Bali are too far. Maybe Australia does not understand, the Australian government, the Australian even public opinion does not understand what could happen if the Israeli secret services, the Israeli intelligence community would not warn Australia from a bomb on board one of your commercial jets, and what could happen there. Maybe only tragedy like September 11th on the Pentagon in Pennsylvania and in the Twins in Manhattan, maybe only such tragedy can convince the people to understand that terror is terror is terror, and it doesn't matter what mask it wears. And I really hope that you Australians, my dear friends, our dear friends, won't suffer a tragedy before you'll be convinced. Better be precautious and understand the meaning of mindfulness, of strategy, of policy before you need to respond. It is better to design and shape and not to respond. So probably you, let me be not politically correct, Australia did not suffer enough from terrorism in the last few years, and your memories are gone. Second, I'd like to discuss something that, I just went into that today. And just yesterday, our Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, thanked the Prime Minister of Slovenia for taking the decision of banning Hezbollah. Now, Slovenia, 2 million people in Europe, probably not the main nation state and people that suffer from terrorism, and especially not from Iran and Hezbollah, has understood its role and mission as a part of family of nations. Slovenia. May I add Guatemala? May I add the Czech Republic? Of course, I can add Switzerland, Austria, Germany, and many other nations in Latin America that after I've been called immediately to brief their politicians personally and to explain them how Hezbollah is built and what is it capable. I saw results in few weeks and months. So what is going on here regarding Australia's behavior? Now, let me tell you one thing. Sometimes there are political parties that along history or governments or just policymakers that thought that if they will hug a potential enemy, it may be a benefit for them in the case of trouble. We'll have connectivities, we'll have connections, we'll be able to deal better with them if something's gonna happen. Now, I would like to thank Jason for bringing the octopus to the table, because what I think is that probably the Australian government think that they can hug an octopus, but they do not understand that this octopus is actually a lethal one, and he can poison you. And actually, he can kill many, many Australians and many of its allies. Now, it doesn't make sense to hug such a beast. So I'm wondering what's going on here. Because Australia, for many years, when I learn military history, I see that Australia positions itself as a part of its morals and values in the front of the coalitions that went to fight against terror, against evil regimes like Iraq, for example, and other places. The Australian forces, the famous great Australian forces, were always there, next to United States of America, Great Britain, and others. And Australians actually were trying their best to act in West Iraq, for example, when Israel was under threat. And I deeply appreciate it, So what is going on here? Don't you understand what Hezbollah is? So invite me immediately to explain it again in Canberra. I did it many times. I can explain again via Zoom. I can take the next plane if needed. And let me explain you that Hezbollah is an organization that contains an army. It is not anymore terror organizations. It is terror army. I fought against them when they were a battalion. Then they've been transformed into terror brigade. When I've been in command of the 91st Division in 2006 war, I fought against an Iranian well-prepared, well-trained, well-equipped division, terror division. This is unique. And today, after having all their experience in fighting in the civil war in Syria, it's a terror army. And it's not only a terror army. They are instructors because they train the Houthis in Yemen. They train Iraqi terror cells in Iraq. They train any terror organizations that just ask. They did their best to infiltrate into Sinai Peninsula in order to install their capabilities inside Egypt, but the Egyptian government fought successfully against this attempt. So they tried today in Syria, and they did everything. They spread themselves everywhere. There are mafia. It is not only a terror army or instructors of terrorism. They are a part of the mafia. They are politicians that use the double hat syndrome. When they want, they put on nice suit and jacket and tie, and when they want, they put the gear on and just go and make terror activities. They act not only in Lebanon and not only in the Middle East in tier 1 around Israel. They acted, as my mentor Boaz just mentioned, in Burgas, Bulgaria. They acted in Bangkok, they acted in Delhi, they acted in Cyprus, they acted in Tbilisi, Georgia. They are a part of the Revolutionary Guard. They are a part of Quds Force. All this capability, and here I come to wrap up everything. Look, the idea, the result, that today the world is fighting against Iran as a type of an octopus, as a type of a beast, as a global instability creator. They affect terrorism, nuclear capabilities, they have armies, they have missiles, they are trying their best to have weapons of mass destructions. It is Iran. And they built such infrastructure, such an alignment, which is so effective. Unfortunately, we must say it. Israel is surrounded by terror armies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic jihadists, Iranian militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen that affects the moderate states in the Middle East. It is all Iran. This is a failure, big failure of the international community since the end of the 70s, where after the coup against the Shah with the Ayatollahs until today, it's a failure. Now, Australia, that always was the first to join any mission against evil and against terrorists and against enemies, should be again in the front. And I really hope something's gonna change before tragedy will convince you to join again the jihad. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought, Kimberly, if I could just throw back to you for a moment. You were recently questioning and prodding and poking agencies about their attitude to some of these issues. And I've seen it reported that the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, talks about Sunni Islamic extremists remained their greatest concern. And we're talking about Hezbollah, which would seem to indicate they're literally not on the radar. Now, maybe I'm being unfair. I'm just reading from a newspaper. You've been doing the questioning of the agencies. There seems to be no line of sight or no focus on Hezbollah and its activities. Is that a fair assessment in your mind after many hours now of asking questions and prodding their consciences?
I don't think it is. I think that they are aware, and obviously without going into a lot of detail necessarily, they are certainly aware of diaspora communities here in Australia, and perhaps their sympathy, or more than that, to organisations like Hezbollah. You know, obviously Australia is also living in an extremely contested part of the world. As you would be aware, we're having issues with our neighbour to the north, China, and certainly they have become more assertive, if not aggressive. So, you know, I think that what we've seen from both sides of the aisle here is people wanting to fund and to have clearer definitions around, you know, what they might, in order to pursue terrorist organisations and their, you know, their people, their resources. So, you know, we are, I think the intelligence agencies, so the military defence here, military intelligence here, I think is very much aware of these issues, and of course actually has a long history in Lebanon. So and has you know had, we've had, you know, the Australian Defence Force, or as it was the Imperial Defence Force in Lebanon, you know, a long time ago. So I think that I wouldn't say the intelligence agencies are, you know, are ignorant or turning their, you know, their eyes away from a particular organisation. And I think, though, that what is interesting here is that people are watching to see what a Biden administration will do in terms of Iran. So, you know, that what they get in, what I think, you know, what those sanctions are doing, I think there's a desire probably to, for those sanctions to continue. And obviously that will only go to lowering the amount of money that Iran sponsors Hezbollah, and then also the, you know, working with other like-minded countries in order to, well, to kind of capture and encircle terrorist organisations, including Hezbollah. But I was going to say, you know, one of the things I find interesting, and I've been in Lebanon, is that because Hezbollah manages a vast network of social services, including infrastructure, healthcare, schools, youth programs, etc., I find it interesting that a Pew Research Centre study in 2014 found that 31% of Christians and 9% of Sunni Muslims held positive views of the group. And I think this sort of goes to the fact that Lebanon is a country that needs a great deal of help and is not in good shape. And I think, you know, we're going to need, I think it was very good that Emmanuel Macron visited there twice in person, despite all of the travel restrictions that coronavirus has brought. And I think he did that because there is such corruption and, you know, distortion in their political system and also in their banking system that, you know, I think we are going to need to actually change those views within Lebanon, and that means really changing Lebanon in a way. But also I think we're going to have to look at what America does with those sanctions. And I hope that they continue. I really hope they continue. And, you know, there's alarming reports that Iran has more fissile material than anyone ever thought they were going to have. So you have to wonder, given that Hezbollah is kind of an arm of Iran, what that actually means in the Middle East as well. So I think there's a number of issues, and I think the intelligence agencies here in Australia are aware of that because there is a large diaspora community here, as you would all be aware. So I think we do, you know, that's why this inquiry I think will be very good.
Thanks, Kimberly. Apologies for tossing you another one, but I think for those watching, particularly from overseas, they should understand the Australian Parliament is engaged in some really important work at the moment, and Kimberly's at the centre of it. And Kimberly, in the last 24 or 48 hours, has voted on another piece of legislation, along with the Labor and the Liberal Party, about what we call foreign interference laws. Now, given we always describe Hezbollah as a proxy for Iran, is there a capacity to capture Hezbollah's operations, albeit what they pretend are benign operations, under that legislation, that we've got to force them out into the public? Or is it purely nation states that are captured? You may not even have had a chance to consider this yet, so apologies, I'm tossing you a few curly ones. What are your thoughts? Could we also be targeting the Hezbollah operation in Australia under that piece of legislation, and congratulations to Labor and the Liberal Party for pushing this through. Obviously, China was the major target of this, but is there an opportunity? And then I'd like to throw to the panel about, can we find a way to stop saying, hey, they're just Iran's proxy? Can we tie them more directly so that it will be captured?
So this week, the Foreign Relations Bill passed here, and it is looking at all sorts of agreements that the state governments here, but not only the state governments, any foreign, any agreement or arrangement that has been put in place with a foreign entity. I think that there is, what we're doing in Australia, I guess, is creating a network of legislation so we can capture threats to our national security and to our sovereignty. So under the Foreign Relations Bills, anything that the federal government would be able to examine and veto those arrangements. I guess the problem with an organisation like Hezbollah is that it is, it would be covered by so many pieces of legislation. So, for example, in narco-terrorism, it would be covered under other legislation because obviously we don't allow legal importation of narcotics here. So it would be, so it's illegal activity. So I think in terms of foreign relations, it would be captured. And of course, I just chaired an inquiry into diaspora communities in Australia, and and that report will be published very early next year. But looking at those diaspora communities, so obviously we were also looking at Chinese Australians, but also other diaspora communities that have problems with their home countries, because sometimes those regimes threaten those diaspora communities. We are going to, from there, I think, create other pieces of legislation to ensure that our national security is not threatened by anyone. So I think that we would be able to look at Iran, and we would be able to look at Hezbollah. And of course, if Hezbollah was to do anything, any funding of anything here, whether it be legitimate or otherwise, then we would be able to capture that and terminate those arrangements.
Thanks, Gummy. Jason, would you like to comment on either of those two pieces of the legislation, the Senate, the committee that's just been set up? Would you like to give us any thoughts on those?
Sure. I'm not sure specifically about the legislation or the committee, but just wanted to support what Boaz was saying at the beginning. Look, quite frankly, I think it's an intellectual and academic cop-out not to define terrorism. That's the first thing I'd like to say. Everybody here in this panel, everybody listening to this seminar knows terrorism when they see it, and probably, unfortunately, has experienced it. Absolutely. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and I apologize from shifting from natural selection to sci-fi, but let's stop falling for the Jedi mind trick that's being applied over us, and particularly across our policymakers. And I don't mean to cast that across you, Kimberly, in this trick that's being played on us to think that there's somehow some separation either between Hezbollah and its various tentacles, or between Hezbollah and Iran. There is none. So let's dismiss and debunk the Jedi mind trick absolutely. And I think that just to go to what Gail was talking about, what concerns me almost more than the violent part is actually the non-violent part, because that creeps up on you. And again, I come back to where I started. It's much harder, and potentially this is where Australia, has a challenge, because the mind, the context which Boaz and Gal and Yaniv lay out, it's quite different to the Australian mindset and what we've grown up with in this country and what our political leaders have grown up with and our policymakers and our academics. And so it's for us to try to continually educate them about that and take them to show them that right in the field. But if we don't do that, then they'll fall for the seductive aspect of this non-violent. And part of the non-violent trick is to co-opt people inside our system. So they actually create supporters within our system. And so if you stand up and you say that you're against that, then all of a sudden you get labeled Islamophobic, right? Because you're standing up for fundamental Australian Western democratic principles, right? And it's not, you're not labeled Islamophobic from people from that part of the community. You're labeled Islamophobic from people from the ABC or from your academic colleagues or from your colleagues, your neighbours, because they've slowly subverted, infiltrated and co-opted the non-violent parts of our society. And I think, to me, that's far more insidious and dangerous than just focusing on the violent side.
Thanks, Jason. I think Kimberly just wanted to add something.
I just want to add, we also this week passed the ASIO amendment bill. That's going to it amends the compulsory questioning framework. So it will, because we know that obviously you can have young people, via the internet being radicalised, that will allow the questioning of 14 to 18-year-olds. And it's going to be, it's passed, so it will be used to enable the use of questioning warrants in relation to espionage, politically motivated violence, including terrorism, and acts of foreign interference. So this is just another part of the network of legislation we're creating here to protect national security. But I think, to Jason's point as well, I mean, when you're looking at any organisation that is able to pass itself off as a de facto government or a de facto, governing institution, that is always a problem when it is not de jure. And I think, there are many organisations in parts of the world. I've been to Shan State in the eastern part of Myanmar, and that is actually run by people, smuggling heroin, and they provide schools and hospitals, etc. But the Myanmar government cannot control that part of their own country. So that's another example, I think, and Hezbollah is an example as well. And that's why we have to eradicate these organisations. So, I think that what we are trying to do is to include as much as we can. This has gone through the Parliament. Obviously, there are some, some of the crossbench is not enthusiastic about 14-year-olds being able to be questioned, but it was advice from the security agencies here that young people can be radicalised, and, that sometimes that needs to happen.
Thanks, Kimberly. And I have received a question, and I was going to throw to Alan to see if there are any questions, or Albert, that have come through while we've been talking. But the question, Boaz, Australia is the only Five Eyes country with diplomatic presence in Tehran. This is invaluable, our allies say, and would Australia jeopardise our presence in Iran if we classified all of Hezbollah as terrorists? What's your thoughts?
First of all, let me apologize that I would need to leave within 10 minutes because I'm starting to teach in Israel. We need to prepare the next generation of scholars and experts in this field. I would like briefly to refer to some of the things that we heard, and then I would answer your question. I would do it as briefly as possible.
Please.
First of all, I don't think that there's a problem of absence of tools in Australia to deal with Hezbollah. It's an absence of determination. So it's not a question, is this law or the other law will give the ability for the authorities in Australia to deal with the presence of supporters and elements of Hezbollah on Australian soil. It's probably, and I need to be humble, I'm not Australians, but it probably has to do something with the fact that you have a large diaspora, Lebanese diaspora community, and therefore you're more cautious, you're more reluctant. It's not a question of values, it's a question of internal politics that interfere with what needed to be done, the way I see it as an outsider, if I may say so. And by the way, although I tend to believe that the vast majority of this community, Lebanese community, is loyal to Australia, has nothing to do with Hezbollah and Hezbollah terrorist activity, we do know that Hezbollah, wherever they are active around the world, they are always based on those diaspora families. They are looking for those bad seeds within those communities. And unfortunately, bad seeds you have in any community, but when you have a large community, probably you have more bad seeds than other places altogether. Now, the other thing is the confusion that Hezbollah induced by the fact that Hezbollah is a party, is a political party. It's a part of the parliament. It's a coalition in the parliament. It's a coalition in the government, the Lebanese government. It's a social service group. It's a criminal group. It's mafia, all of the above. Gal was mentioning them as a terror army. Well, my friends, forget about all of this. This is not important. Our discussion is focused on one question and one question only. Are there terrorists or not? Because if you ban them as terrorists, all the rest come as a side benefit for the decision to ban them because they are terrorists. Once you ban an organization as a terrorist organization, you have a lot of tools, international tools, internal tools to deal with the organization, and you would have impact on all the other bad aspects of the organization. But the question is, are they a terrorist organization or not? I invested all my elderly life in trying to analyze terrorist organizations, and by all means, they have been, they never refuted their position as a terrorist organization. And let me finish by quoting Naim Qassem, number 2 in the hierarchy of the organization, saying, Hezbollah has a single leadership. All political, social, and jihad work is tied to the decision of this leadership. The same leadership that directs the parliamentary and the government works also leads the jihadi actions. It's not me who's saying that. It's Hezbollah themselves who are saying that. You cannot try to do this artificial division between the external security organization, the military arm, and the rest of the organization.
And so the question was about whether Australia in Tehran would be punished.
So I'll be blunt on that as well. I hope that this will interfere with the connection between Australia and Iran. I think this is another very negative side of the Australian foreign policy. I don't see it in a good eye that they are holding the stick from both sides. Iran should understand that there is a clear distinction between the normative global behavior, finishing their subversive activity in so many parts in the world, their involvement in terrorism, the threat that they pose to so many countries and regimes around the world, and then they will be accepted as a civilized member of the international society. You cannot have good contact and give the excuse that you do that because it gives you a good intelligence eye on the organization. Israel has also a very good intelligence eye on Iran and doesn't have, as you know, diplomatic relations with this Arab country.
So you believe that it would, or you believe it wouldn't?
I don't care. I hope it would.
Thank you. And I see Alan's joined us up on the screens. Alan, have we got a couple of questions? I'm very conscious that we may lose a panelist, and I would consider that very poor chairing if we ran so far over time that we lost a panelist. So, Alan, questions if you've received.
Okay, I just want to start with a question to Kimberly from me, and that is, how often and in what forum do the Five Eyes countries meet about Five Eyes issues?
They meet, well, Obviously, that's been very difficult this calendar year, but in normal circumstances, they meet regularly, different parts of it. And certainly there are, I mean, it's not always talked about, so I'll just be a little careful. But I mean, they do meet regularly, and there are different components that are talked about, if I can put it that way. And I think it depends sometimes as well on what other meetings might be going on at the same time that might facilitate a meeting of the Five Eyes.
Okay. With that in mind, all the questions are on 3 related themes, Stephen, and I'll leave it to you to throw them to whom you think is best equipped to answer them. The first one is, how do we get the Four Eyes to speak to Australia and say, get on board? Who can do lobbying within the other eyes to embarrass us? Number 2, who's best placed otherwise to embarrass Australia into making this decision? And thirdly, who's to blame for this apathy? And there's been a few people who have said, is it a sensitive issue for federal Labor MPs in Western Sydney with large Lebanese voting populations?
Either of the first 2 questions, it's probably a Kimberley apologies. I'm happy to help Kimberley. But the first 2 questions, Gal, Yanni, Jason, feel free to jump in on the first 2 themes that Alan just raised.
So, Jason, who is best placed of our allies, our friends, to embarrass us into this decision?
Well, I don't know whether any of them are more best placed than any other. I think that as a collective, they all have a responsibility. That's kind of there's a collective security responsibility and obligations on all of them to make sure they operate in a unified manner. You know, parallel lines of operation, parallel lines of sharing intelligence. You know, part of this. The approach that they take and the approach that any good operator on the ground that's gathering intelligence from the field is that my data becomes your knowledge in a continual cycle of solving problems and challenges as it confronts you. And that's how Australia should be, Australian political leaders and legislators should be embarrassed, is that you're not playing a part in being that knowledge creating cycle in order to stifle and suffocate an evil organization such as Hezbollah. And I don't think it necessarily matters who it comes from, but potentially it could come from all the other Four Eyes to make that claim to Australia, make that demand.
Yeah, you'd have thought that Boris Johnson might call the Australian Prime Minister and say, remember that 20 kilograms of stuff we found in that house in North London that Israel told us about? We saved thousands of lives with that intelligence. These are the people you're dealing with. Why won't you ban them? But anyway, obviously that doesn't happen. There's a question from Michael Eason. He's asking what other organisations might be banned besides Hezbollah that we allow. But just before we get to that, there is a question there, Stephen, that a couple of people have asked, is it a sensitive issue for Labor's federal politicians in Western Sydney? They have, a very large Lebanese population out there. Is it
there's no question, Alan, and I've dealt with this, and Kimberley deals with this today. I dealt with it for over 20 years. It goes back to, there was a decision to deport the Mufti. Many, many years ago, I think in the 80s or early 90s, and lobbying by senior New South Wales federal members of Parliament had that decision overturned. I mean, the decision had been made. He had to go for his conduct, his statements, and a concerted campaign was run out of the Western Sydney MPs, and a couple in particular that has had influence, that overturned that decision. Now, looking back in hindsight, that was a disastrous decision not to do it. But it was done. So it continues to be sensitive. I'm fortunate to be sharing the Eason's home. They're in a different room. And we were talking just before about threats made by the Mufti to Morris Yema about running candidates against the Labor Party in elections because they were unhappy with positions. And Morris would not be stood over in that way and got an overwhelming result in the Lakemba booth, even with that sort of intimidation and threat. So it takes strong leadership to stand up and say, no, we're not going to be intimidated, whether it's China or whether it's a Mufti in Lakemba. So Kimberly, did you want to add anything to that? That was a bit of historical context.
Look, I was just thinking as you were speaking, it just goes back to that's principle in politics, that one must be principled. And I mean, you can't really allow, I mean, if something is wrong and something is wrong for your country, I think, you know, you have a duty not to allow it to stand. And I think, you know, there are issues with any politician being influenced in that way.
Here. Now, I'm very conscious that Boaz, as he said, has to go and begin his lecturing, and I'm conscious of the time and the lateness in not just Australia, but in other countries that are watching. Alan, if there's no more pressing questions, I wanted to thank each and every one of you. I'm sure you join me in wanting to thank Albert for his extraordinary efforts. The amount of time and energy he puts into this is incredible. And I think it's appropriate to raise a glass and say, Jerusalem next year.
Jerusalem next year.
And thank you all so much for your contributions. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to those who've been watching and firing in questions to Alan. And good luck. And Jerusalem next year.
Thank you very much.
Shalom.
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 Shalom.